Hello. I am very happy to welcome everyone at this Bank of Russia conference titled 10-year anniversary of Megaregulator. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow, I'm Elena Tikhonova, the RBC channel anchor person. And we're today celebrating the 10th year anniversary since the Bank of Russia became a mega-regulator. Large-scale changes did take place in the Russian market. A lot has been done. So the conference is dedicated both to the results and the future. So during this first session, we will discuss what has been possible to do during this decade. What are the projects that has been done? What are the main successes? What are the main difficulties? And the fork roads that appeared through this journey, how the monetary policy, macroeconomic policies change, and what out of that experience we may take away into the next decade. We'll take a look from different angles at these issues because the speakers on this panel have an enormous experience working in the financial market, and one way or another, each of them has been very actively involved into the discussion of setting up the Megaregulator as an issue and its establishment itself. So I'm very happy to welcome our guests, Igor Shuvalov, the chairman of EBRF, Anton Silyanov, the Minister of Finance of Russia, Elvira Nabiulina, the governor of the Bank of Russia, Sergei Shvetsov, the chairman of the advisory board of the Moscow Exchange, and Oleg Vyugin, professor of the High School of Economics. First off, I would like again to congratulate everybody, particularly you, Elvira Sahibzanova, on this jubilee. Right before the session in the recesses, we were talking about how fleetingly these 10 years have flown by, and overall how many different things have occurred during that period. So now let's talk about the way this mere idea of setting up the single institution, which is going to be responsible both for the supervision and regulation and for the development of different financial market sector, how did it emerge? Where did it come from? And how did it come to be? I believe I shall start with you, Oleg Vyugin. You were heading the Federal Financial Market Service then, and you were amongst those who championed the establishment of the single regulator, because from the very onset, it was suggested that the Megaregulator would evolve out of your service, and if I'm not mistaken, that idea has been quite actively promoted for several years. So why did you insist? Because I do remember you were particularly insistent, saying that the regulator must be independent from the executive power and the government, but there was quite a resistance to this then. Yes, thank you. Good morning, even good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would like to remind us that, in fact, in 2004, when the Federal Financial Market Service was established by the government, at that very point in time, our service was granted the authority to oversee, regulate almost all of the financial institutions in Russia, with the exception of the banks and the insurance companies. So that was already the first step towards a consolidation within a single regulatory body of the regulatory market regulatory power. But actually, when we were then talking about a mega-regulator, we didn't mean, in the first place, the task of consolidating within one institution supervision of the banks and the insurance operators, like in the single bunch, like the case is now in the central bank. What do you mean? Well, I mean, it was a very good start. Well, it was a different idea, basically how within a central bank one could achieve a certain autonomy and the right of a partnership with the financial markets in its regulation. That seriously is different from the way the government is operating, because the government really works following the clearance and the custody chain processes through the government agencies. And so what we've been confronted by in practice, that the regulatory norms that had to be introduced had to go through very difficult and complex clearing processes, which created the opportunities from lobbying from the bottom. Just imagine when the Minister of Finance is busy with the country's finances, the issues of market regulations are important, but not the most important for the Minister of Finance. Maybe that is not the case. Well, yes, well, basically, that is what we saw, so, i.e. that the obvious idea of setting up a central depository, we had to spend several years in order to facilitate this idea. I mean, in my tenure, we were not able to get that support, although it was Igor Kudrin, who was the Minister of Finance then, and in the Ministry of Economy, the Minister of Economy was headed by Herman Gref. You imagine the amount of efforts I had to apply to convince them to do that. Well, eventually they both agreed to this. They did, but I think later on, when I was no longer the head of the Federal Financial Services Market, so what was the idea here? The idea of a mega regulator is not only in covering with its authority this whole of the financial market without any exception, but maintaining a certain autonomy that is a legal entity of a societal public law, but not acting according to the governmental principles. And that is exactly what we see in the central bank today. And I believe the reason as to why the mega regulator eventually had been set up in the central bank, because that is the status that the central bank already had then. I do recall quite well when we contacted the presidential administration with a request to somehow find a legal resolution in order to set up a mega regulator outside of the central bank and the government as a fully independent, autonomous entity with a certain public legal framework. We were told that nothing like that is mentioned in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't mention any body like that, but the central bank has written in it, and that is why I believe we gradually came to setting up such an institution on the basis of the central bank, or rather within the central bank. I do remember that, I think it was in 2005, together with Andrei Kozlov, we paid a visit to Sergei Ignatiev, who was then the governor of the Bank of Russia, with a proposal to consider including the federal financial services market into the central bank in order to set up the mega regulator. But Sergei Mikhailovich then was not inclined to make such a decision. He said something to the extent of, it's too early, that is too difficult, let's not just do it now. But it eventually happened. And I believe it happened despite everything. No, not really despite everything. I think Igor Shirvanov said it correctly, that the time has come. Things have ripened for that to happen. Well, thank you very much. When the regulator was being discussed, you worked in the government and you are definitely familiar with all of the details of those debates. What were the most contentious points, do you believe, then? On which side of the whole matter you had doubts, and who did you have to convince ultimately? I didn't have any doubts then, because I think that the whole matter has over-ripened, because it was not really my idea, because out there in the world there are several constitutional models about how the chief regulator is leading in the banking and the financial markets. There are separated models. There are others where the executive power is subordinate to it. There is another one that we are developing. You can imagine that we are continuing to live under the Constitution of 1993 with various amendments, and even now the dispute about the role of the central bank and its place continues, whether it's fair to have it like that. First of all, I support such constitutional model because I believe that those who were developing this constitution and the people have endorsed it, and it's quite adequate, and it supports all of the political changes and the economic crises, and we see that the whole of the political system really manages quite well, and not the least role here is being played by the regulator. I really don't like this kind of a mega regulator, because I believe that we need to make sure that this is a single mega regulator, because the central bank doesn't have yet the whole of the authority in order to be truly described as a single regulator. I think this remains to be a mega regulator, but I would say that it must be much more consolidated in terms of the authority, some of which is not yet in its hands, in order to ensure the throughput, regulation and oversight. And just a little bit more way to go, seriously. And by the point in time when we were going through the 08-09 crisis, the central bank already had the kind of form and shape which fully reflected the model described by the Constitution that was and body independent of the executive power, and one of the very few institutions that could be marked as the top-class, world-level institution, working not worse than the Federal Reserve System or the UK Treasury. That already was a super-professional apparatus with a very decent payroll, with a lot of respect in the market, and clearly within an executive system to resort it and build another instrument like that would have hardly been sensible. Mr. Vugan is saying that it could be possible, and I'm sure that it wouldn't have been possible, and I really think that there was no need for it. And there was another idea approach that is not quite resonating right now, and I believe that we need to revisit it every now and then. Clearly, Moscow is an international financial center, but despite the fact that we're currently living through, but a mainstream idea is what we should follow. And if the Moscow is an international financial center and the ruble is a regional reserve currency, then there should be a different regulation and supervision in place in the market. So I launched the advisory process with the president, with the governor of the central bank, and many other people who are no longer working in the government, including Mr. Graf and including the government people. And I've spoken to a great number of people, and step by step we were arriving at the single understanding of how that should be done. Some were more in favor, some less, but I knew that one shouldn't really crash-gate that idea, so that all of the government officials who later on must support the idea of such development, not only passing the law, because you need to pass the act and then make it all come true. And for that purpose, everybody should be united by this common cause. I think that I'm even sure that altogether we've been able to do that. I didn't have any single doubt, and the 10-year experience, the way we went through the 2014, 15, and all of the subsequent events in 2021, and what we've gone through in 2022, it all points to the separation between the central bank and the government in terms of the financial authority, and their ability to come to terms was the right thing to do. Igor Ivanovich, if I may just ask you to comment shortly, what kind of authority we're lacking for the Megaregulator to have in order to become a single regulator? Well, you see, I'm sitting next to my direct regulator on my left, the Minister of Finance, and I'm thinking that I would rather avoid commenting anything. I would say that just the legislation could be fine-tuned a little bit more. Elvira Sahibzadovna. Well, since you're sitting to the right hand, Minister of Finance is on your right. Let's not really touch the executive powers of the central bank. Let's leave it to the future debates. But, rolling back to the 10-year period, do you remember which side you were on towards this idea? And most importantly, what this kind of status has given to the central bank? Well, as opposed to many of those seated here, I belong to the doubters who were quite cautious towards this idea. It seemed to me that, bearing in mind the fact that the monetary policy is being pursued by the central bank independently, while the development of the financial market requires a very close interaction with the government, and because of that, the independence of the monetary policy could suffer, and on top of it, I had just a few fears of, although such an experience was being accumulated in other central banks, but such a large-scale accumulation of the monetary policy, the regulation of all of the market sectors, the securities market, and then the consumer right protection, such a major consolidation, and our central bank then essentially became a trailblazer through such a consolidation. On top of it, possible positive consequences were clear, and additionally we were all aware of the need to strengthen the regulatory and supervisory and the development function of the non-banking sector, because the banking sector is quite dominant and the non-banking one is not. On top of it, of course, in other countries after the 08-09 crisis, there emerged an understanding that the central banks not only are responsible for the inflation of the monetary policy, but also for the financial stability. And that was a bit of a new kind of responsibility. But when I came to the central bank, there already was such a decision made, and I ought to say that September 1st, 2013 and 2014 was the first testing year for the Megaregulator. We ended up being in the new environment. Let me remind you that towards the end of the 2014, we were to finish our switch to the targeted inflation as well as the floating exchange rate. And it was all happening with the financial crisis in the backdrop. And the kind of decisions that we were making were quite complex because we were raising the key rate by 17% in order to curb the inflation hike. But it was clear that for the financial markets, that was a double shock. First, the key rate was going up, then the exchange rate weakening because of the oil prices. There was a lot of domino effects visible in the financial market. And I understood then that the Megaregulator, being able to see the whole market and having the necessary tool set, can work simultaneously with many things. Apart from the key rate, we issued regulatory easing to the banks in order for them to be able to adjust. We introduced currency refinancing. We offered liquidity to brokerages, and we were able to see the full picture. So I think that 2014, for me personally, was the confirmation of the right thing done, although I entered into the project with some doubt. So you were making an exercise before 2021. Well, we had a lot of exercises. I mean, I can't even name the year. Back into the 10-year period that we didn't do any exercise at all. Another kind of an awareness came in our minds for the practical kind of things positive about the mega regulators, which is a large-scale health of the whole of the banking system. Everybody remembers the Moscow Circle, which had the banks and non-banks, assets were being stripped and hidden, then the auditors would come, the assets would be put into a different legal structure. So to sever that ring, to do the proper and quick administration, you had to formally prove that the assets were stressed. Without having put supervision, that would have been very difficult to do. The third, I guess, which emerged, particularly where I currently see a big advantage in having a mega regulator, developing the function of the consumer and investor rights protection in the financial market. This function is still evolving, and the mega regulator, without allowing for the arbitrage, to introduce a single set of the consumer and investor rights protection, because if it were one organization responsible for the insurances, a different one in the securities market, then the third one to oversee the deposits in the banks, I'm sure that would have been very difficult to do that in terms of instituting the single sales rights. And so overall, having a financial market as a single institution, because currently we see that the borders between the sectors are fading away, and so one has to work in order to avoid there being an arbitrage between all of the sectors, because Sergei Anatolyevich, when he was back in the days in the central bank and in charge of the non-banking sector, he used to say, so how come with respect to deposits we have subsidized taxation, but in terms of investing into the securities we offer this kind of a preference to the banking sector? And so to institute the level playing field, that is the kind of the view we had to follow. I mean, I can mention a lot of points in terms of having a lot of benefits out of the Megaregulator, having such a single look at the market. I'm sure that it really was a good thing. Well, Anton Gavrilovich, did you feel satisfaction when some of the functions were vested in the Megaregulator from you? And do you agree to these major advantages in the work of the Megaregulator that have just been announced? Well, good afternoon. I believe that creating a single Megaregulator and passing the functions of the Financial Market Service Agency to the central bank looked to be quite banal. And as Mr. Shuvalov stated, the central bank was a very powerful institution, a very powerful body which controlled the monetary policy. In any case, it used to have professional people, adequate finance, necessary resources. respected by all, as opposed to the Federal Financial Market Services, which was a force. I mean, during Mr. Vugin's tenure, no, after his tenure. I'm just telling the truth. I'm telling the truth. Because everybody was complaining then, very low pay drag, money's not enough, and henceforth, level of professionalism was not a good one, but that sector, you know, including insurance companies, pension funds, that is almost like the whole of the financial system. And that is why I actually remember the meeting that was chaired by Mr. Shuvalev when he was the chairman of the cabinet. We had a lengthy debate whether we should move it and whether we should not, but I believe that the decision was arrived at in a very correct way. I mean, actually, right now, I would disagree with that, but at that point in time, it was an absolutely correct thing to do, because a very powerful central bank with its infrastructure and the capacity to oversee and control the whole of the financial system from the point of view of its infrastructure and organization, that was an absolutely correct thing to do. And we used to have insurance and pension and non-government pension funds and non-financial institutions, and the banks, they have been linked in with each other, so there was a need for a single, very powerful supervision, and so quite clearly we understood that we were putting it into the very sound hands of Elvira Sakibzanovna, because it was already in the air, you know, that the central bank was going to be headed by Mrs. Nabiulina. So it all depends upon the kind of hands that you put it in. So we were ready to do that. So all of this put together, this whole list of factors, it really was very effective. And so 10 years down the road, we see that we did the right thing. You see, very serious supervision, control of the market. That means the trust on the part of investors and the customers to this market. And if it's in very sound hands, that really points to the stability and resilience of the whole of the financial market. Now, that was the right thing to do. Now, whether I regret it or not, I don't. But you said that you would disagree with that. Yes, you know, right now I would disagree with it, because the government structure, the Ministry of Finance, really has become a much, you know, much more serious agency. And your paycheck is high. Not only that, because, you know, together with the central bank, how shall I put it, we are communicating quite well. We didn't do that in those times, in between the central bank and the federal agency. Better communication between the Ministry of Finance and the central bank, because essentially you can describe it as the single institution when we deal with the common challenges. But 10 years down the road, I would say that was the right thing to do. But the thing that happened, you can't change it. Well, it's a great birthday that we're celebrating for the Megaregulator, and actually about this dialogue between the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Russia, we will go back to that because I've got a couple of questions. Sergei Anatolyevich, you as a direct actor of this whole effort to join the Federal Financial Market Service, how difficult it was during the initial stages? What were your top priorities then? Well, just looking at the history, to me, a Megaregulator is, you know, combining the central bank and the Megaregulator, because the UK's experience in 2008, when the Governor King had the banking supervision taken away from it, he said that he saw only one advantage in it, because he was able to sleep tight during the night. Because then, after 2008, the UK Central Bank, I think it started being whimsical, and then a very simple question arose. It's either the budget or emission. And since the government grown used to being able to cover the problems of the central bank with more money printed, so it was not about the payroll of its employees, but who was supposed to pay for the holes that have been identified in the course of the regulator's activity. And so we had a lot of billions allocated to the pension funds, so a lot of issues were about the banking system. So the government didn't want to pay. In the United States, it was a different story, because the fiscal system was able to solve issues, but our Minister of Finance prefers not to look at the fiscal issues. So for the Minister of Finance, that was a very good thing to happen, to pass this weak links in terms of the supervision and put it upon the central bank's shoulders, which, in case of a well-organized supervision process, would be able to cover these gaps. And so one of the most important things was the banking system, because the previous governor leaving the banks, he spoke in the Russian parliament, and he mentioned that, and at that point in time, the central bank had to face three challenges. First of all, the accession of the federal financial market services, then inflation targeting, which still was not finite, and Mr. Vugan, I believe, started that, because I do remember when you came around and you were writing down the main guidelines for the monetary policy. It was then in your office. Basically, the central bank was getting ready for that 10 years, and Mrs. Nabilou did it in 2014. So those were the three challenges. So there was no resource made available to cope with that. And when, on September 1st, we deployed ourselves in the federal financial services market, it was myself, Mr. Chistukin, and Vasily Medvedev. So three individuals, like Pizarro and Cortez. They landed in Peru and Mexico, a very little group of people. Additionally, I was having trust from the chairman. It was very important because 80% of the central bank didn't want that accession. They wouldn't even they wouldn't even put the tissue paper in the lavatories. They wouldn't organize catering, so employees didn't have anywhere to eat, and all the way down to when we were supposed to get a payroll, we had to work with the eighth version of the payroll program when everybody else was using the seventh one, so nobody knew how to use it. So the first task was to ensure business continuity and employee loyalty, because I believe that one of the most substantial things in M&A process is to take along the positive part of the culture of the people who are accessing. If you don't do it in the right way, then you would lose some people and culture. So Vasily Medvedev was covering such things as administrative matters, while Vladimir Chistukin took under his guidance all of the business processes related to supervision, and so then we started working out the strategy. I disagree that the federal agency had poor people. I don't know about the leaders, because I spoke to the leaders and the senior executives before the accession, so I had some reserved feelings, but the second and the third level were very strong, and so we put together a strategy with the central bank, improved on November 11th, 2013. So starting on November 11th, we already had a plan that we followed, and in December we had additional deployment. Larissa Silutin, Elena Tchaikovskaya, several people from the supervisory function. So we also had Alexei, who had to be in charge of the consumer protection, but Elvira Zahibzadovna really was very, very helpful. And later on, she said, Mr. Shevtsov, we have some tasks in the central bank to reform the banking supervision, so don't take anyone out of the banking supervision department. And so we then realized that we had to go people from within, or to hire somebody from the market. And so, generally speaking, it seems to me that we were able to really do it well. Another thing that I believe important to underscore, we were lucky that Mrs. Nabiulina came around, because I had this very clear understanding that within the central bank's culture, before then, this kind of accession and combining of efforts would have been impossible, because it was like a silo thing. So we had to develop a single culture, and the whole energy was, or synergy rather, was coming not from us being isolated, but rather that together with the banking supervision, the banking financial stability, and the monetary regulation, we had to create a single institution. And even before we came to the central bank, Mr. Vesterovsky was really very helpful, because he came to to the central bank, we started developing values and ethos. And actually, the first project was launched in September in 2013, and that was digitalizing the Russian financial market on the basis of the forum, which was headed then by Mr. Voloshin. But that was the digitalization described as paperless technologies and remote communication. The AI was nowhere visible then. So, of course, today, saying digitalization, we mean a totally different thing. So we're able to ensure the loyalty on the part of the employees. We created the structure which was adequate to the task that we had to face, followed by an everyday run-of-the-mill. Together with the market, we started integrating further. What was very important is that when Megaregulator was being established, and that was not specifically mentioned, that the market was against it. There was a very broad perception of the supervision being very tough, like the stock market and the insurance operators have grown used to not there being any federal financial market services. So it was like free for all, do whatever you want, and everybody was afraid that the belts will have to be tightened and nobody will be able to breathe. And that was why they were able to, argue for the second peak, so Twin Peaks concept, the self-balancing system that will enable the market, in terms of the number of behaviors, to run them under their own control. Well, regrettably, the law was too late. It took place a few years later, rather than simultaneously. And today we're just coming to a certain construct. But within 10 years, the second part didn't demonstrate its effectiveness. So we had doubts whether it would work at all. So currently NO4 has literally became the single source for the capital market. The insurance companies also have their own platform, and the pension funds as well. Now, the question is whether we should revert these authorities into the central bank or whether the self-regulation will take off is the question for the next 8 years. Well, actually, let's continue talking about the self-regulation, and we will start looking at some of the specific results of the 10 years of Megaregulator. I would ask every speaker to mention the top key thing that you believe occurred throughout these 10 years. Oleg Vyacheslamovich, market self-regulation. Do you believe it was the right decision then? Is it still right now? To what extent this side of the Megaregulator reform turned out to be effective? Well, principally, the global experience shows that one may develop self-regulation, one may not develop self-regulation, one way or another, the financial market is going to be. But in our case, when concentrated authority within a single institution, self-regulation is a useful tool. Useful from the point of view of it not being a lobbying organization which is lobbying for the interests of the financial market players, although there's no avoiding it. I mean, it will be, but it is rather an entity that shapes up behavioral things, the rules, the codes, and monitors their compliance. And the more effective it is, then the central bank, as a mega regulator, will have stronger interest to pass to that entity some of the authority which is not particularly in order to maintain a normal dialogue with the financial market. And so, in my mind, the existence of the self-regulatory organization in the financial market is the means to maintain a dialogue. In the very beginning, I already mentioned that in the financial market, a regulatory entity is not a purely supervisory one. This is an entity which is a partner in developing the market. And I'm sure we will still be talking. I mean, we're already talking about how it all really worked out very well. I believe it is very important that the central bank started going that way. And the colleagues who are seated in the room or outside of today's room would agree that the central bank, in many ways, today, it is a partner in developing a financial market. And from the point of view of the policy that it pursues, and from the point of view of ideas that it raises, this is not a passive authority that is looking at the way the ants are buzzing about. It is not trying. It is really getting to grips with developing a market. And self-regulation really fits into that system quite well. So there is a dialogue. Yes, there is. Thank you so much. Igor Ivanovich, as far as the development institutions are concerned, how has the regulator demonstrated its attitude towards it? Have all the institutions been set up using the full potential of the financial markets in order to be much more active in promoting structural transformation of the national economy, including raising venture investments? Well, in this case, I think it is worth mentioning a very recent presentation that the governor made in the upper house of the Russian parliament, when the governor stated that the development institution must play a more significant role in the development of the national economy, and the VEB contribution into GDP. I mean, whatever we do is 2 to 3%, while in China, the similar kind of institution is doing 15%, and their balance is almost $3 trillion worth. I mean, in our case, our economic size is more modest, and whatever is to do with it, you may play a more notable role when all have the specific expectations, the commercial banking industry, the Bank of Russia, and most importantly, the government, because the biggest stakeholder in the development agenda is certainly the executive power. So if we have had the Megaregulator for 10 years, then the Mega Development Bank has been around just for about 3 years, but that is not my idea. That was the idea that the chairman of the cabinet proposed, and we are simply just making sure that it works, together with other separate development institutions. Basically, all of the main functions were vested into the VEB, with the exception of the mortgage sector, where the development, construction, and housing sales is being done, which is VEB-RF Corporation. It is not under our umbrella, but as you mentioned, the dialogue, I would say that we are having a very good dialogue. Formally, VEB is not under the supervision or the regulation by the central bank, but from the very first day that I joined this organization, I felt that this really should be ended, because I do recall all of the discussions and this whole thing going on behind the scenes basically ended up being a problem that myself and the Minister of Finance had to solve. The more there is a transparency for the Megaregulator and the leading government agency in these issues, like the Ministry of Finance, it is clearly that the whole agenda can be implemented in a partnership with the commercial banks. And so we've been expecting that our achievements would be recognized, and as it seems to me, the leadership of the Bank of Russia have been supportive of these initiatives through the fact that the special banking regulation has been adopted, which, based on special ratios, allowed us to work with the commercial banks. And so currently our financial transactions are developing very actively. Sometimes there are questions posed to us by the central bank. We do maintain discussions. It's no secret. Right now, the central banks and now in terms of the commercial banking sectors and the development banks do present new adequacy ratio requirements. Maybe not the new, but more specific ones. And so we are eager to support this discussion. Clearly, it will involve the Ministry of Economic Development and the Ministry of Finance. We believe that the structure of our capital is maybe different from the capital structure of the commercial banks. And again, we are looking at the experience of the Chinese and the Brazilian banks, which are the biggest ones, and the concentration of the assets, which is considerably different from the way it should be done by a commercial bank. But in any case, we do understand that to independently develop a project without the commercial and banking sector is something that we won't be able to do well. That is the current model and our basic factory project finance development. When we put
но в основном капитал заемный это коммерческие банки. И для нас вот сейчас мы развиваем сложный проект, один из крупнейших, может быть, в стране инвестиционных проектов. Мы по нему докладывали в Центральном банке, и мы для нас это новый вызов построить синдикат не из 2-3 банков, как мы научились сейчас. Сейчас мы уже научились. Вот ВЭБ вместе со Сбером и ВТБ, ВЭБ вместе со Сбером и Газпромбанком. Это мы уже умеем, делаем неплохо. Но так, чтобы это было 10-15 банков, мы пока не умеем. И постараемся эту работу вместе с правительством и Центральным банком провести. Так что у нас есть все возможности для развития диалога. Он сейчас высокопрофессиональный и существует. Мы увидели новое регулирование Центрального банка, которое ожидали. За него мы благодарны. Ну и, конечно, не подведем ни нашего акционера правительства, ни регулятора в целом коммерческого банковского сектора. Будем дальше...
Nor the regulator of the commercial banking sector. We will promote this further.
Антон Германович, а у вас как диалог складывается сейчас?
Mr. Silanov, in what kind of dialogue you're currently having with our Megaregulator?
В совместном видении и
Because you've got a lot of topics that you are jointly covering, and I can suspect that not always you see eye to eye. I mean, out of what came out into the public area, cryptocurrencies or the fiscal stimulus. Central Bank, almost in every press release, described it as one of the main pro-inflation effects. What are you having an argument about? No, I mean, we're having a very good dialogue, aren't we? Yes, I mean, there's no argument with respect to the global items as well as in terms of our kindred spirit. I mean, we're monetary authorities, and the budget and the monetary policy, this is like the one thing. If there is some easy thing in the fiscal system, there will be a tough thing in the monetary one, on the other way around. We can't do this in any other way. We are having a very good normal dialogue. We are listening and hearing each other, and that is very important for the whole market, and that's the way it shall remain. As far as common issues are concerned, we've got quite a few. I will mention the cryptocurrency later, but together we have prepared and we're currently implementing the financial strategy. We put together a long-term savings project that is going to be launched next year. Then this is all constitutes our joint product. And it seems to me that it really is a good thing. And actually, we're also working together as part of this government subcommittee on foreign investments. When foreigners exit, together we review the terms and conditions, acquisition of businesses. In the similar token, a lot of good dialogue. There are certain arguable items. For example, when we were talking about the need to stimulate the economy, incentivize the economy, the central bank said, why should we be so scrupulous in terms of the base? Why should you could maintain such a great system to be implemented in the city of Voronezh? Because the central bank is not only about the inflation, it's also about the economy. And in the government, we have always been expecting the central bank to look into that. So it's not only by employing the key rate as a tool, but the regulatory ones are extremely important. Whether money flows into the mortgage market or into lending, or won't it, it all depends upon the central bank's regulations. And here, at times, we do want to enjoy more freedom, less regulation from the central bank towards the commercial banks, or cryptocurrency. Well, I mean, yes, even now, we hold different positions. I mean, but the cryptocurrency is the fact of life. It's there. And there's a whole bunch of transactions taking place every day. So we believe it is wrong not to regulate it, and so we think that the legislature has to prohibit something like doing settlements and certain other transactions. However, certain things have to be made legal, because we shall all gain more in terms of the market development. But in the meantime, we are having a discussion about it. Well, currency control, I cannot but mention it as well, because this is quite a voguish kind of topic, because previously the central bank was very tough, very consistent in terms of standing by the central currency control. On the contrary, the Minister of Finance was more liberal. Yeah, we've switched places now, right? We are for tougher measures about monitoring, controlling the flows, well, because you understand the situation, but the central bank is on a more liberal kind of side of things. But as nothing doing. I mean, we'll find common solution anyway. Well, it was not me to raise the topic of the currency control, so let me ask you just one specific question. How do you see now, I mean, this consensus possibility with the central bank about the currency control? We're looking for it. We're looking for it. And the one who is looking would always find something eventually. Okay, then let me pass that madly over to you. Do you have any vision of an ideal currency control? Not very liberal, something that the Minister of Finance doesn't like, not very tough kind of, that the regulator is against. And my second question, Mr. Siluanov said that indeed you've got a lot of functions to attend to, like the ruble stability, economic stability, protecting the financial system, protecting the rights of the financial services consumer. To what extent do we believe that the Megaregulator has been successfully navigating in between all of these tasks that are so diverse? Okay, just a couple of words about the currency control, because you can talk at length about it, and the devil is always in the details. Well, the currency control, before all of these events, we've agreed with the Ministry of Finance that we need to liberalize the currency control measures, because people are dodging it, bypassing it, mandatory sale and repatriation. We launched them in spring, along with other measures, in order to stabilize the financial market. Nowadays, the currency control measures, I believe, should remain, I mean, the ones that have this mirror-like nature, while in the second part of it, because everybody is afraid of the capital flight, that is preferring foreign currency, because this is the flight not only outside of Russia, but when the currency deposits grow within the system, that is also accounted for by the system. That is preferring ruble-denominated assets, because that is being treated and cured with a different set of measures, including the key rate. And such currency restrictions, I should say, must not create difficulties to our economic players and agents who currently are struggling, but are able to find ways to settle and continue their businesses. So in that general picture, you need to identify what else or what is subject to fine-tuning. Now, the second question, which is more fundamental, indeed, we have a lot of functions, because I remember when the draft act was being discussed in the Russian parliament about the mega-regulators, the Russian parliamentarians were asking us this question: what are you going to do with the conflict of interest, with the conflict of objectives? And they've written into the act that we have to have a special procedure in place to regulate this. We built Chinese walls, but I really should say that we really didn't have to, because Sergei next to me was talking about the central bank's culture and values. Every function, every division was very separate, with very weak interactions, so we needed to really not build the Chinese walls, but to develop a very positive synergy out of us being a regulator, communication, information exchange, feedback culture. And that was the kind of the corporate culture that we really were trying to develop and continue working on it. But of course, we do see this diversification of goals, because you find it in the examples of many companies. So like a person, you have a lot of conflicting choices. Now, how can you decide where to go? To me personally, one of such complex decisions where there was a conflict of goals was the cleansing of the banking system. at the expense of the central bank, at the expense of emission. Many people were saying that it happens at the expense of the budget system. We all remember that it was 2014, 2015, and the state of the budget there, because it was impossible to find a solution at the expense of the government. So the choice was to stay with that banking system, which in itself bore a big risk to the financial stability. But we were aware that the higher key rate would make it. And so to me, it was the most difficult choice to make. But then now, simply because the banking system is a dominant element of the financial system, I believe it was basically impossible to live it as it was. So the choice was made, but the experience of other countries where the fiscal system is heavily involved is very important, and then we won't really have any discord over whether it's Basel regulation or the Voronezh regulation, understanding that the risk of the weak banking regulation can fall upon the budget. But this way, we were in a continuous discussion, championing the kind of the banking regulation so that the banks would be able to withstand stresses, because stresses take place on a regular basis. So I believe that is an unresolved long-term topic which continues to remain as an issue, as a certain potential conflict of interest, but I do hope that within such a large-scale restructuring, we won't have to really resort to it. Now, the second thing where we currently see problems because of such a conflict in terms of the conglomeration of purposes and functions, this is a conflict of instruments and tools, because every policy has its tool set, like the monetary policy, maintaining inflation, key rate, the stability of individual financial institutions, is a prudential banking regulations, the norms and standards so that every financial institutions could be resilient. Now, there is a systemic financial stability as well. We've got macroprudential standards, regulations, various limitations where we may see possible bubbles emerging in any sector. And we hear continuous appeals that tool set for one policy should be used in order to solve problems in a different policy, not to take into account the consequences of various policies, but, for example, to apply macroprudential regulations within the consumer lending, not in order to reduce the share of the risky borrowers, but to slow down the consumer loan growth and not to raise the key rate. That is something that we're continuously hearing. We see it, and that is the consequence of the multiplicity of objectives. We think this is bad because we won't be able to achieve our objective if we are going to apply macroprudential regulation instead of the key rate. First of all, we will have the overflow of the lending from the capital funnels into where there is not enough of it, and so the risky loans and lending will displace the non-risky ones. But so eventually the policy is not going to be transparent. The rationale behind our decisions will be something that nobody would understand as to why we apply this or that tool set. So these are basically the kind of conflict-wrought situations that emerge every now and then, where we had to identify a balance. Another example, which is very important for the market players to hear, when the mass investor emerged, not accidentally, because we worked together with the market over it. So the mass investor, popular investor, emerged in between the market players who do see in us also a partner, and they started saying, why are you tightening the balance? Why are you trying to protect the investor rights? We have just started to grow this qualified, non-qualified investor. Let the market deal with it. We have the responsibility to protect the rights of investors, because investors must understand the risks. Long term, for the market development, it is important for an investor not to get disappointed. And so that is the kind of a dialogue that we are continuously running, as well in terms of the conflicting stability and the development set. We're dealing with it on a daily basis. Like in the first part, I said that synergy is helping us to respond to certain challenges, but certainly this everyday search for the right balance is what we are always busy with. Now, with respect to the mass private investor, do you have any questions right now to the Megaregulator, specifically in terms of, are you not really overly protective and just rather give us money and we will deal with it? Now, being on the other side of the fence, how do you view your own creation? Well, for the 2 years, I'm not supposed to be on the other side. I'm going through sort of a period of cooling, so I'm not on the other side. I'm a bit of in a limbo in between the two. So, just looking at the global experience, successful markets are tough markets. You can't have a liberal financial market because liberalism produces fraud. And there aren't any examples which would show the other way around. So all of the existing examples do confirm this statement, that the foundation underneath the stability and the quality of the operation of the financial markets in a very hard, tough protection of the weak party. So ombudsman, the standards that are currently being produced together with the central banks, they are beneficial. So speaking about the fork roads, there's always time, strategy and tactics. So we're able to come to terms quite well with the marketplace about the strategy. Not a problem, everybody understands it in the same way. But whenever you talk about timing, the market, 12 months, while the central bank is trying hard to build its strategy based on a longer-term time frame. And that is where the conflict is, because the market needs to make money now in order to feed the people, to buy new hardware, to pay the software developers, while the central bank needs to really raise trust. Because a spoon of tar into the barrel of honey spoils the whole barrel. So you can't allow the war took place 10 years ago. We looked into the statistics. The household accounts would live for several months. After that, they would run out of money. The new ones will have to come in. And so the brokerage houses were going through this, cycle all the time. And so this toughness, currently, the brokerage accounts are existing for years. If you don't look at the blocking of the assets, we can say that we are now out into a positive period, because there are very few accounts that have money disappearing from it, so people are beginning to earn money. And the happy broker is the one who has happy customers. That is about the strategy. But as far as the tactics are concerned, of course, it really would be nice to print the bonds with 10% margin and, nobody would care what will happen afterwards. So I have no grievances towards the central bank these days. Honestly, we've always tried to be transparent and build long-term strategies that the market players would take into account. So right now it's very difficult with the longer-term part of it, because there is so much, there's so many clouds. It's hard to see into the future. And I fail to understand in the current currency regulation what is tactics, what is strategy, but I do understand that in the form of shape that the information is being disclosed these days. Thank God that we really gave up on the right to produce full disclosure. That is a victory. But nevertheless, I believe that the trust, there's a bit of a handicap, but it is melting. So it really would be great to see in the new guidelines that would come out in the autumn about the future of that currency regulation. And certainly one should avoid discrediting the ones who are not ours, because there are certain elements when the corporate bonds are discredited compared to the government-issued bonds. I believe this is wrong when the Russian investor is discredited against the Kazakh investor. These are the little things that need to be improved, and so once the understanding is there, because I believe that the currency regulation currently is tactics rather than strategy, and so I think that we need to bring back that particular trust to the development institutions as well. Thank you so much. Well, we've been able to discuss as much as we could in a very quick way the key results of the past decade. Without doubt, the regulator has done a large scale, big job. A lot of things have been done by the market players, the government institutions, and other organizations. But of course, throughout that 10-year period, there were ideal storm situations almost every year, like the governor said, brought about by the external factors, the sanctions, the pandemic that really brought down and disrupted many of the supply chains. So now let's do a bit of voting on that. And now I would ask you, the guests in this room and those who are watching our broadcast, to answer the question, what do you believe to be the biggest success and the biggest challenge for the Megaregulator over the past 10 years? So here's the QR code. Would you like to also vote? Well, I can give you a microphone, but you can... Oh, all right. Says one can vote twice. So the QR code is on the screen right now. So both in this room on the screen and also on the screen that is being watched live. So it is very important. Please mind you, don't forget to press the button vote at the very bottom of the page, because only then your vote is going to be accounted for. Now, let's round up that 10-year period, and so we need to see what we think while the voting is going on. In a few minutes, we're going to wrap up the results. But very quickly, a question to every speaker. Bearing in mind the trends that are currently showing themselves and will remain for some time, what out of the experience of the past 10 years you will take along into the next 10 years? Igor Ivanovich, you voted already? Would you be starting to answer this? I would take everything. Maybe a bit of new authority? Well, yes, one should never give up on your expertise. Even if it was a negative one, you should take everything along. Mr. Sulanov? Well, what shall I take along with me? Well, I believe that we are not standing still. We are developing. So what one should take along? Well, it seems to me that one should follow a very clear kind of an objective, i.e. the financial market and its resilience, the stability and the trust to it is the foundation for the economic development. We won't be able to move without it. The economics, it's not about the government budget, government money, because some people think that give us as much money as you can and we will do whatever we want. No, that's not the way it works. To win the trust of the customers, that is what one needs to develop. That is something that one should take along into and make your plans based on that. All right, Mrs. Abiyulina. So what do you believe out of the past 10-year experience you believe is really something that one should have for the next 10 years? Unfortunately, we need to maintain our 100% readiness for the shocks to happen, so there should be certain resilience built into the system, and that is what we need to take along. We, as a Megaregulator, now have the market development function, and even under these dire, current, fast-changing circumstances, like Mr. Shresov said, a lot of clouds, to work long-term, to make long money available to this country's economy and to this country's population. And also, what was mentioned, the key thing to us is trust. We've worked a lot to have it. We appreciate strongly the kind of trust that is shown to us, because one can really lose it very quickly. Well, in terms of the currency regulation, I do agree, because we were trying to build a system whereby capital could move openly. So we had to tactically make this decision and retune it. But I do hear that there is a need for this, that everybody needs to understand and see that regulation as transparent one. So partnership with the market, only within a partnership, trust can be cemented, and that is something that I would like to take along into its future navigation. Thank you so much. Thank you. Sergei Anatolyevich, what would you take along into the future? I've got 3 priorities noted here to make decisions, because this shameful part of our story, it took us 10 years to discuss things when it was quite obvious. So in these new circumstances, we cannot afford this kind of a time to market as far as regulation and business development is concerned. So we need to make a decision. Actually, it has become quite widespread because I see that the Ministry of Economic Development joined the corporate regulation. Back in 2014, nobody argued against central bank being the corporate regulator. Now, with the reform being worked on, they forgot to take out this authority from the draft act. In Russia, with 7 cooks in the kitchen, nothing will cook out of it. And so, we need to bear this in mind, seriously. So concentration within the central bank in terms of its responsibility and authority is a very important token for the good quality and speed of the decision-making. The regulator has to change. The central bank changed in 2014, 2017 in order to become an effective banking regulator, monetary regulator, and the capital market regulator. So what is in store for us is AI, and the regulator will need to change. Without having changed, the regulator won't be able to make sure that the market continues to develop. And the formula, walk your talk. And I believe the market would really find it quite promising if this dialogue doesn't remain just a dialogue. Mr. Vugan, 20 years has gone by, since 2014 almost, from the idea of a mega regulation to a successful execution. And it seems to me that this whole journey shows what needs to be taken into the future. The capacity, the ability to decide and make decisions, agility, and the ability to respond to new challenges. So I am confident that changes will definitely take place in these areas within the next 10 years. I'm not going to specifically say what those are going to be, but within the next 10 years, the system of regulation is going to change. Well, you're all speaking in innuendos today without really, speaking the whole thing. That's the kind of time we're living in. Well, let's continue the dialogue and let's take a look at the results of our voting. Like the first data already was given to me, like in the Central Election Commission. So what I believe to be the first biggest success of the regulator over the past 10 years, with quite a lead. That particular answer was 35%, the biggest success, setting up the mere and fast payment system being set up. Well, SPK is in this room, and the key challenge over the past 10 years, almost 38% of our respondents identify as the lack of trust to the financial market and the pursued policies. Elvira Sakibzalna, I think I would ask you to comment briefly these both answers. Well, if I were to vote, I really would have been struggling, because I cannot attribute weights in between all of these options, because the conflict of interest is apparently somewhere deep inside me. Now, the fact that the market players voted, I believe that the mere and fast payment systems, the recent achievement, I do recall that there were a lot of people who were against it, against creating this system. So many arguments and objections. And so I feel that in many ways the fact that it really worked out was a bit of a surprise to many. And I'm very happy to see that the support of financial stability is in the second place, because that truly was an important accomplishment. Now, in terms of the key challenges, there's something that we believe to be important, where there is a risk of losing trust from the financial market, and the commonly pursued policy, something that needs to be further worked on. And so, to me, this response from the audience basically shows that we need to pay attention to foreign assets block. We know how painful it is. All of the market players were proud to see that the popular investor appeared, and several years down the road, its assets have been blocked. So we're trying to solve this problem in every possible way. We are discussing many options. Clearly, not everything is dependent upon us, but we understand how important it is for the financial market to develop, to solve this blocked assets problem solved. Predictability and transparency. Let's look into the next 10-year period, of course. Yes.
доверия.
So everything
О
is
будущем
for
финансовых
trust.
рынков, вот продолжая тему,
Now,
которую мы
the
сейчас
future of the
начали,
financial
что
market,
будет происходить
carrying
в 10 лет
forward
будут
on
ли
what we've
следующие
just
10 лет?
touched upon,
Пойдет
what kind
речь
of
о
next 10-year
наступившей
period is going
сессии,
to
она
be. We will
начнется
talk
ближе
about it during the
15
next
июля,
session.
что
It will
называется
start off here
финансовый рынок
at
России
3
через
p.m.
10 лет
and it's titled
приоритеты
Financial Market in Russia in 10 years' time, development priorities. Don't
развития.
miss out on it. It's going to be
Я
really very
благодарю
exciting and
всех
interesting.
участников
I'm grateful
нашей
to all
сессии.
of the
Еще
participants
раз
in this session.
поздравляю
Once again, I
Мегаregulator с
congratulate the
прекрасным
Megaregulator
созданием с
and all
десятилетием.
those who played
Спасибо.
part in this process on its 10-year anniversary. Thank you so much.